Thanks for downloading a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned for your 3CR podcast.
But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens would mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens. So are you surprised the Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Good afternoon, gentle listeners, and welcome to Yeah Nah Pasaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith.
I'm Andy Fleming.
And joining us from New York City is Christopher Mathias, who is a reporter with Huffington Post covering the far right. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
I guess just to begin with, Chris, how did you come to find yourself on the far right beat?
So I've been at HuffPost for a while, and I used to cover criminal justice stuff and a lot of kind of the NYPD being bad. And I started covering, are you guys familiar with stop and frisk over there as like a police tactic? Yeah, so the NYPD was using that a lot in New York, normally against people of color. And then I covered that for a while and then started covering, there was a big scandal here that the NYPD was surveying Muslim communities in Brooklyn and New Jersey and just kind of all throughout New York. And it was very egregious and dumb and bad. And that got me to covering Islamophobia more generally across the country. Namely, after the attacks in Paris, there was like a kind of a surge in Islamophobic incidents here. And obviously, as Trump kind of came into power, he was expressing a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment. So at any rate, covering Islamophobia kind of just segued naturally into covering the far right more generally, because it feels like Islamophobia, I think this is probably true in Australia too, is kind of the glue that binds a lot of far right movements together. At any rate, in summer of 2017, I found myself, I'm from a small town in Pennsylvania called Gettysburg, which obviously has some historical significance, it being, the site of the biggest Civil War battle. And I ended up covering a neo-confederate rally there, and it was very silly. It was a bunch of militia dudes, some KKK guys, and a bunch of run-of-the-mill, sons of Confederate veterans who, just love kind of fetishize the Confederate Army and stuff. So I was on the battlefield with these guys. They had fallen for a fake Facebook event, which alleged that Antifa was going to show up to the battlefield and pee on Confederate graves. But the problem with that is that there are no Confederate graves in Gettysburg. There are no more Confederate graves in Gettysburg. So Antifa never showed up, but a Confederate guy did accidentally shoot himself in the leg. Wrote a good story about that. And then later that summer, me and my coworker, Andy Campbell, our editors sent us to Charlottesville. And so we were in Charlottesville for Unite the Right when, everything went to shit and Heather Heyer got killed. And we were there for 4 or 5 days. And then when we got back, our editor-in-chief in the time sat me and Andy down at a bar and told us that this was our job now and that we were going to be covering the far right for a while. And and that's what I've been doing ever since.
Chris, just out of interest, you said you were from or grew up in Gettysburg, and there was this neo-Confederate event that you reported on. What's your sense in terms of the general history of how the Confederacy is understood and what it means, its significance among contemporary Americans in that part of the world? And do you think there's been a kind of nostalgic revival for some sense of the South when it was glorious? Or is it the case that this is just a tendency that's always been present that comes to the fore at certain points?
Yeah, man. I think it's probably there's a push and pull because I think it definitely comes to the fore at different points when the kind of the far righter is resurgent, like we've seen over the last 5 years or whatever. The Confederate stuff has just been at the center of so many incidents. And it really is the battle over how people remember the Confederacy here is really a battle for the type of it's kind of the center of everything. I think a friend of mine always likes to say that the Civil War never ended. We've been fighting that battle ever since. And obviously Charlottesville revolved around a statue of General Lee. And where I grew up in Gettysburg, you would think in a place like Gettysburg, which was the site of the biggest defeat of the Confederate Army, that people would be less susceptible to kind of misinformation and deliberate misremembering of what the Confederate Army was all about. But that's actually not the case at all. I grew up listening to teachers tell me that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights. Watching movies like the movie Gettysburg, which is an enjoyable movie to watch, but it very much embraces this lost cause mythology, right? That there was a noble cause that the Confederacy was pursuing, and that it was this kind of brothers on both sides of the war, and it was just kind of this noble, tragic war, and it prevents the Confederacy very sympathetically, and that kind of stuff is just everywhere. And I guess the flip side to that, though, is that we have seen so much movement over the last few years of Confederate statues getting torn down, and of schools being renamed, and so forth and so on. Hundreds of monuments have been torn down. I think some of the most significant, inspiring moments for the last few years here have been seeing young people and students tear down these statues, which happened immediately after Charlottesville, I remember. But yeah, I think the Confederacy and the lost cause is at the heart of the American far right. It's a fundamental part of kind of American fascism.
One thing I thought was curious about Charlottesville is there appeared to be a convergence of forces, various forces on the far right, including neo-confederates, but also featuring prominently individuals such as Richard Spencer, who I understand attended the University of Virginia and yet would in other ways represent a different demographic, a college-educated, erudite, fascist propagandist. And yet, following Charlottesville, that my question is, what's become of those forces post-Charlottesville? Because it seems to be the case that Richard Spencer is one of many whose stars have kind of dimmed over time.
Yeah, no, they're a mess. People are in prison, in hiding. A lot of the groups have disbanded. So Richard Spencer, for example, is, I think, back home in Montana with his parents. He is from a very wealthy family, and actually, interestingly, likes to, speaking of the Confederacy and slavery, likes to talk about his family's history as slave owners. But yeah, he, I think, basically just went broke from the lawsuits that he was facing as a result of Charlottesville, and had to kind of move back in with mom and dad in Whitefish, Montana. And then, some of the other prominent groups like Identity Europa, they kept getting infiltrated and doxxed and eventually disbanded. One of their leaders in Charlottesville, this guy Eli Mosley, stole some valor and tried to claim that he was an Iraq War veteran. And it turns out he was just in the Pennsylvania National Guard, but was never deployed overseas. So he kind of went away in shame, and then has basically been in hiding because he's avoiding this lawsuit. And now I don't know if anyone really knows where he's at. And then, oh man, who else? Matt Heimbach from the Traditionalist Workers' Party. It's hard to keep track of, but Traditionalist Workers' Party also kind of fell apart. He also had an incident where he was caught making out with his stepdad's girlfriend. It was real complicated. I think his stepbrother or stepdad was looking through a window and saw Matt Heimbach making out with his girlfriend or wife or whatever. And they had a big incident falling out, which kind of precipitated the end of the Traditionalist Workers' Party. So, and then of course you had the National Socialist Movement, which is kind of the more straight up neo-Nazi group led by Jeff Scoop. And Jeff, a year or two ago, claimed to leave the movement altogether, is now claiming to help de-radicalize people, although I'm kind of skeptical of that. But at any rate, this is kind of a long way of saying that after Charlottesville, anti-fascist organizing here was really effective because people got deplatformed, they got doxxed, they got exposed, they got fired. There was real social consequences created for having attended that rally. And I actually think we're seeing a lot of parallels to that with what happened on January 6th at the Capitol. In the few months since then, we've seen all these people get exposed and doxxed and arrested. I think there's a lot of people that maybe regret having participated in that.
You mentioned people stealing valor. You've also reported extensively, I guess, on people coming from the other side, not stealing valor, but perhaps hiding their power level within the military. How big of a problem is the far right for the US military? And have you seen the US military's approach to this issue change over the years?
Yeah, so it's definitely a problem. It's always a problem that's kind of hard to get great numbers about, but you talk to to a lot of veterans and they'll tell you that's, what a crazy problem it is. Like, extremists are attracted to the military for a lot of reasons. One of which is to get, combat training that they can then use for, maybe to inflict on civilian targets. But, I first started kind of covering this a couple of years ago when there was a big infiltration of Identity Europa's chat groups, and Unicorn Riot got a hold of all their chats. And using their chats and working with a couple anti-fascist researchers, we were able to find 12 active duty servicemen in Identity Europa. Since those stories published, I think half of them were kicked out and half of them have been allowed to stay in, which I think kind of tells you a lot about how the American military approaches extremism, which is to say it's like very uneven and disorganized, and they will often let people that are straight up neo-Nazis stay in if they, show the slightest bit of remorse. And it's like very much up to like commanders' individual discretion as to, what punishment they face. But oftentimes I wouldn't be surprised if those commanders are often sympathetic to far-right white nationalist views. That kind of changed after the insurrection, because the initial reports showed such a high number of veterans and people with military affiliation storming the Capitol. And our Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, issued this stand down order, which basically required all commanders over a month period to sit down with their troops and have a discussion about extremism and the dangers of extremism and how it's not acceptable, which, isn't it's basically just an elaborate talking to. It's not much of it's really, I don't know how much that's really going to accomplish. But now the Pentagon is trying to claim that they are, going to increase standards for who they let into the military, that, maybe they'll be a little harsher when it comes to discipline. And I think we're just kind of waiting to see how that all pans out. After the Secretary of Defense announced this stand down order, I actually did a story about this guy named Sean McCaffrey, who was mixed up with Identity Europa back in the day, and ever since has been hosting this super racist anti-Semitic podcast. And he's kind of been tied in with the whole Groyper scene here, with Nick Fuentes and that crew. But yeah, I found out that he graduated from boot camp in March, so a month after this stand down order happened. And it was very much an issue of had a recruiter bothered to Google his name, a lot of shit would have come up. So right now we're just kind of waiting. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens to him, because I could foresee the military allowing him to stay in because they don't understand how far American far-right extremism works. He'll have some plausible deniability and claim that he's not actually racist, or they're going to actually be, for kind of PR purposes, just kick him out pretty fast. But we should know within a couple of weeks if he's allowed to stay in.
You're listening to Yeah Nah Passaran on 3CR, 8:55 AM, 3cr.org.au and 3CR Digital on your DAB radio. We're currently talking to Christopher Mathias from the Huffington Post about the far right.
And so do you think that Trump's replacement with Biden, does that signal a shift not only in terms of military, or potential shift, not only in terms of military recruiting practices, but I guess how else do you think the Biden presidency is in a better or worse position to address these sorts of questions, including more general questions about racism and Islamophobia and so on?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, it's obviously a relief to a certain extent, just because, I mean, obviously the insurrection at the Capitol was evidence, I think, of what a lot of reporters on this beat here have been trying to scream about for years, which is that, this is very much a kind of fascist, insurrectionist, mass movement that's been emboldened over the last 4 years because they've had their guy in the White House. So the fact that he did lose, and that we did kind of beat back this attempt to steal the election, you can't help but feel some relief there. But, as for Biden, I'm skeptical of their general approach to the far right. I think, Biden comes from this very kind of bipartisan conciliatory approach to the right and to the Republican Party, which I don't know how effective that's going to be for beating it back. And I think he is also, the Democratic Party has often, especially when it comes to Islamophobia, kind of participated in it and been very willing to kind of betray like my Muslim neighbors and friends, and encouraged the government to survey on Muslims and so on and so forth. I think they also often, what the Democratic Party is very bad about is throwing the left under the bus all the time. Will often, they like to do the whole kind of both sides thing where, it's extremism on both sides and there's, something in the center that's better and good. And, I think they're the type of people that will gladly participate in prosecuting Black Lives Matter protesters and anti-fascist protesters that, have been engaged in this kind of revolutionary moment here over the last year. I don't have a ton of faith in the Democratic Party's ability to really confront the far right here, especially when they keep kind of throwing the more radical left here under the bus, which, even though it's the radical left that kind of makes shit happen and is on the front lines.
I guess the Biden administration may offer some opportunities to confront far-right extremists in the military and in various other policies, but it would probably be unwise to entrust the fight against fascism to President Biden or his administration, it seems. Is that an accurate enough summary of,
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I think that's I think if you had talked to me 5 years ago, I just wouldn't have had as much perspective on all this as I do. And I think, I was looking at the kind of all the guests you've had on. You guys have had on some really great guests. And I think some of them have probably had a bit of a similar journey to me, which is that the last few years has kind of like radicalized me a little bit. And I've learned and seen up close that, like one of fascism's like greatest friends are kind of centrists and like centrist liberals a lot of times who are, in some ways kind of allied with the goals of the far right and fascists. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right to put it that way, that like you just, can't really, there's a lot of reasons to not entrust this fight to someone like Biden or the Democratic Party.
Well, I'll leave the pessimism to you two guys. I'm optimistic that, Uncle Joe's all about masking up. He's halfway to Black Bloc.
No, well, it's true. It's true. Yeah, it's true. And we got secret Antifa infiltrators all over Congress now. So it's,
Chris, you've referred to the events at the Capitol on January 6th as an insurrection. Other people see it slightly differently. Some have described it as, just an ordinary day out for tourists. Were you surprised at how quickly the Republicans have revised history here?
I mean, it's impressive. They've gotten to it pretty quick. I mean, it was always an inevitability. Like they were going to have to rebrand it somehow, but it is a little surprising how quickly it's happened. I forgot. Yeah, I can't believe they're going with the tourist thing. It's so crazy because, I mean, obviously the footage is just they're so obviously not tourists. But yeah, I think they're like, I mean, from the get-go, they were, speaking of Antifa, like they were immediately trying to spin it as this being not somehow representative of their party. And they, even went as far as to try to make this to claim it was Antifa, which is just absurd. But like that gained so much traction. Like they just have like such their own media ecosystem that they can kind of bend to their will and talking points and people will believe it. I remember I did a story on all the GOP, Republican state and local lawmakers that were at the insurrection. Maybe necessarily didn't enter the Capitol, a few did, but like were outside on the steps or whatever. And I think we counted about 57, and about half of those in interviews after January 6th attempted to blame leftist infiltrators and Antifa for the insurrection. And that, of course, those claims have been rendered absolutely absurd. as we've like investigated who was there, and over 400 people have been arrested, all of whom are clearly Trump supporters. So yeah, I mean, the gall is very impressive. I'll give him that. But it'll be interesting to see how the next month or two works out with kind of this revisionist history.
Speaking of media, you're writing for HuffPost, which has a small but significant audience. However, there's other larger media organisations such as Fox News, which seems to play a much more decisive role in shaping American political discourse. I'm not sure exactly what position Fox News as a whole is taking at the moment, but when I think about commentators like Tucker Carlson, it seems that while some have perhaps taken a step back from various forms of radicalisation, Tucker seems to have fully embraced it. I'm wondering if you can comment on what effect you think his kinds of, the vituperations he engages in about the left and the demise of the white race and so on. And given the size of his audience, given that it's reaching an audience that has sometimes been described as being boomer often, do you think that his role, how important do you think his role is in reaffirming and inculcating these sorts of fascist or proto-fascist attitudes in the American public?
He's huge, yeah. He's someone that I'm going to be paying a lot of attention to this year, and someone I'm really worried about because he's getting more and more extreme, and I think he is kind of inheriting, in a lot of ways, Trump's mantle and will be kind of the leader of whatever this fascist MAGA movement is. My editor is very much on the Tucker is going to run in 2024 train. And I think he might be right. I think Tucker might be gearing for that. But I mean, it's kind of hard to overstate how extreme. Like he's always been just parroting white nationalist talking points on prime time to millions of people, and it's always been, I think, a really severe like radicalization vector here. But every time you think he can't go further, he does. And like most recently, I think one of the most egregious examples was like Tucker was straight up talking about the Great Replacement on Fox News. Like the same shit you read in Brett and Tarrant's manifesto is now being said on primetime cable in America with a guy with a bow tie. And it's a really, really scary development. I think you guys are kind of familiar with this process, right? Like you see these talking points and conspiracy theories kind of hashed out on the fringe and the far right, and then they slowly kind of make their way into the more mainstream right. Yeah, I think like it's important to maintain a sense of shock, and I kept having to remind myself like of how batshit insane it is that Tucker is straight up talking about replacement on Fox News when everyone knows what that means and the origins of that. That's been well documented over the last few years. So, and right now, what I'm trying to figure out is like how Tucker really gets stopped at this point, because he isn't going to get like he's the future of Fox News. Fox News is kind of betting everything on Tucker. They're like expanding. He's like going to have like new shows and podcasts and stuff. It's not going to be like Tucker's going to get canceled for saying something too racist. Like he's already saying all that shit. So it's going to be kind of a matter of like we were talking about earlier, like creating some social consequences for him, making what he does toxic. But as long as, Fox News has a say, and as long as I guess the Murdochs have a say, Tucker will be where he is. Out of curiosity, do you guys have like a Tucker equivalent down there?
I mean, one example that springs to mind is Sky News Australia is basically Fox in Australia,
right?
And they've recently, I think, publicly or semi-publicly declared that that's the direction that they want to go in.
Right.
So we have a whole series of commentators who are on during the evenings who are, more or less, they don't necessarily have the bow tie or, they're not millionaire heirs, but they perform the same kind of political function. Relatively small audiences, but huge on social media. So on Facebook, on YouTube, that material is, and I think one core audience is actually consumers in the United States. So we've witnessed various kinds of memes that have been all sorts of things, the sorts of things that Tucker carries on about appearing on Sky News, reaching a relatively small live audience, but then on social media, receiving thousands of shares. And it's a kind of a recognition on the part of the, News Corp, that in terms of revenues in particular, social media is the place to be. So as part of that, what they've also done, speaking of the great replacement, is Lauren Southern is now a regular commentator on Sky News.
Is she really?
And yeah. She's kind of a beloved figure, Sky News. There have been questions raised in Australian Parliament with regards to it. So we recently had a Senate inquiry into media in Australia. In Parliament, there were questions raised with the basically the level boss of Sky News in Australia, who at first evinced complete ignorance, like, what's a Lauren Southern? I don't know what you're talking about. I'll take it on notice. Then some weeks later responded by saying, oh, well, we welcome a diversity of views and we don't pay her. We don't actually pay her wage. So the fact that we don't pay her an income or a salary means that, we're not responsible for the sorts of things that she says. She's just another person with an opinion. And because we embrace free speech, what's the problem? However, it was significant, and I was going to ask you about this actually, Chris. In addition to the media landscape, adjacent to Fox News, you have organisations within the United States closely tied to the Republican Party, like the Conservative Political Action Conference, which also serve as kind of fulcrums for these sorts of ideologies and in a sense, radicalise large sections or segments of the Republican Party. A year or two ago, I think it was 2019 or 2020, we have CPAC Australia. It's importing the exact same model as Sky News has adopted the Fox News model. And Lauren was, the first few advertisements for the event touted the fact that Lauren was going to be the special speaker, like that, she's a real star and she's going to address local conservatives about race and nation and who knows what else. However, there was a minor backlash, and she was disinvited from appearing on CPAC. So there is kind of, and I guess I read that as being certain kinds of sensitivities. The Christchurch killer was an Australian. He was born and bred here before he, went to Aotearoa, New Zealand, to conduct this awful atrocity. He titled his manifesto what he did. Obviously, these sorts of ideas are in circulation, are being adopted by, violent extremists and then enacted. And I think there was some pressure on the part of CPAC, given and the other speakers are very impeccably credentialed establishment figures. I think Tony Abbott was one, a former prime minister. All sorts of people were kind of a part of this, conservative so-called element within Australian politics. But I think that was just, for the time being, just a bridge too far.
Right.
However, she's relocated to Australia. She now lives in Sydney. There were discussions about considerations, and this applies both to Lauren Southern, but also Milo Yiannopoulos, Gavin McInnes, Tommy Robinson, a whole range of other kind of alt-right and alt-right figures. My kind of reading of the situation is that once those careers have begun to peter out in places, in markets like the United States or Canada, Australia is the next best thing. And so there's quite an appetite and quite an audience for Lauren, for Milo, for all these other figures whose stars have dimmed elsewhere. But anyway, that's a roundabout way of getting to the question about, what role do institutions like CPAC, because I believe you've reported on CPAC, what role do you think they have in terms of influencing the current and future direction of an institution like the Republican Party?
Yeah, I mean, so that kind of tension you're describing about like whether or not Lauren Southern could speak at CPAC is a very similar tension at every CPAC every year, because they basically decide which extremists they're going to not allow in or kick out, and which extremists they're going to give featured spots on the main stage to talk. So like CPAC every year is just like, it's such a circus, and it's just kind of, it's where you really see the Republican Party for what it is, and like the different factions that really make it up. I've gone the last 2 years with the purpose of just, kind of identifying all the kind of extremist elements there. It's always interesting, who they allow into the fold. 1 year, Steve King was basically who for your listeners who maybe don't know who it is, Steve King's like basically a white nationalist congressman here who recently lost and is no longer in Congress. But, he was kind of a pariah in the Republican Party and like got stripped of his committee seats and all this stuff. But, then I saw him last year at CPAC and he was just kind of buddying up to people and then kind of ended up speaking on a panel and was like a featured panelist at CPAC. And then it's also one of the more significant parts has been the development of the Groyper movement, like the America First Groyper movement, which is run by this guy, Nick Fuentes, who is young. He's like only 22, 23. And he was in Charlottesville, but he's kind of managed to rebrand this very specific segment of the alt-right into kind of like this Christian nationalist America First bullshit, which has given him some entry into the Republican Party. And I think basically CPAC is always a place where people are trying to gauge that and like see what they can get away with and how far they can go, and so still be allowed in the GOP fold and basically not be a headache for like Republican Party leaders. You often see Nick Fuentes kind of on the fringes of CPAC, I think, trying to figure that out. At this point, like CPAC, the last few years has just been two big Trump rallies, and in a lot of ways is kind of thrown into relief that the Republican Party here has always been, a far right party and has always allowed these people in the fold. But maybe we're just paying a little more attention now.
Chris, I wanted to ask you observations about something based on several years reporting, which is Islamophobia seemed to be a kind of core component of conservative or far-right politics in the United States. And there seems to have been, there are various anti-Semitic currents that are battling which incorporate Islamophobia, but which are increasingly, are becoming more prominent. And yet at the same time, that as I read it, that's kind of like, for some, a bit of a bridge too far. It's possible to, and this is based on, I guess, the general ambience created by the war on terror, to portray Muslims as demonic or terrorist or, constituting a real threat. The same kinds of tropes being applied to Jewish peoples has been less, it seems to create more opposition, including within, some elements of the far right at least. My feeling is, however, that anti-Semitic component is becoming increasingly prominent.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to gauge your kind of understanding of how that's played out, whether it's in the context of the alt-right or the Republican Party and American society more generally.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think these two twin and in some ways closely related prejudices are kind of faring on the American political landscape currently, and what do you think you can say about their futures?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. Well, I think so. As far as anti-Semitism is concerned, one of the developments I find very interesting is Nick Fuentes, who I was just talking about, the kind of Groyper America First movement, is like so explicitly anti-Semitic and like a straight up like Holocaust denier. And, I've sat through kind of hours long podcasts he's done online where him and his guests just say like the most vile shit about Jewish people. Yet he's still given some entry to like, mainstream Republican circles. And then obviously like the GOP here still often attempts to weaponize anti-Semitism for their own purposes with these kind of, in my opinion, often bad faith attempts, where they will lash out at predominantly like our congresswomen of color here who are critical of Israel. And those examples being like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, who, especially recently with what's going on in Israel and Palestine, have spoken up a lot. And the Republican Party always goes full speed ahead, attempting to turn those comments to make them out to be anti-Semitic. So there's like kind of this weird tension or push and pull, I guess, on the right here, where, they're kind of weaponizing these bad faith attacks of anti-Semitism, while on their right-hand side allowing explicit anti-Semites into their fold. And then when it comes to Islamophobia, I mean, it's still like the most acceptable form of bigotry here, and like the most acceptable form of like explicit bigotry here. You know, you aren't going to be necessarily canceled for or, you know, lose your position if you speak in very explicitly anti-Muslim terms about, you know, those countries over there being barbaric, or Islam being a barbaric religion, or all that dumb shit. There's still not a ton of consequences in the Republican Party for saying that stuff. I think thankfully there's slightly less energy there than there was maybe a few years ago. It's hard to overstate like what Trump, you know, wanting to ban all Muslims from entering the country did for Islamophobia in this country. Is, you know, really gave it a lot of energy. And, you know, thankfully maybe the energy's diminished ever so slightly, but it's still very much a problem here.
I guess just finally, Chris, you've talked about, you know, having to watch a lot of nasty and listen to a lot of awful stuff. What's the emotional impact that consuming this sort of material has on you, and how do you deal with it? And has it changed your perception of the world? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think I'd be lying if it didn't take its toll, and I'm sure you guys experience this too. You know, like I was saying earlier, I think it has radicalized me a bit, because you get like kind of a front row seat to how not fringe the fringe is, and you kind of see this propaganda pipeline, right? You know, where you see these fascist talking points make their way into the mainstream, and you realize how people in power are allied with some of the, you know, most evil people you've ever heard talk. It's definitely radicalized me a bit and made me feel like all this stuff is much more of an urgent problem than maybe I would have before. I think the flip side to that though is that, you know, covering this stuff for so long, I've also met some of the best people ever who are working really hard and very thoughtfully and with a lot of compassion and love about like how to fight these movements. That has always been incredibly inspiring. I think I like to joke that I don't like the moments like on this beat where I've like gotten emotional or, you know, maybe cried a little or whatever. It's not at like how it's never at like, you know, watching someone be evil or like it's disturbing, but the stuff that like actually makes me emotional is like seeing communities come together and like respond to this shit. Like that stuff's always really inspiring. Like being in Pittsburgh after the Tree of Life massacre at the synagogue there, and like seeing that community come together, just like extremely beautiful. Like so sad, obviously, but obviously like incredibly inspiring and beautiful. So yeah, I mean, and then, you know, besides that, I drink a lot, so that helps. Well, Chris, on that note, we've run out of time. If people want to read more of your work, obviously check out the Huffington Post, or you're on Twitter at Let's Go Mathias. Thanks for joining us, Chris.
Yeah, it's an honor, guys. It's really nice. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, folks, we're out of time. We'll catch you next week. Global Intifada is up next. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Whoa! Same tricks they used before. They're trying to divide us, but that'll only multiply us. Whoa! The same tricks they used before. They're trying to divide us, but that'll only multiply us. Separation, intimidation, brainwashing the new generation. They use violence, they are tyrants. They make laws and they expect silence, but not us. No, we got to be it. When the guns smoke, they feel the heat. So take action, they're at your front door. Listen up, 1, 2, 3, 4. Whoa, same tricks they used before. They're trying to divide us, but that'll only multiply us. Whoa, the same tricks they used before. They're trying to divide us, but that'll only multiply us. Depression, aggression, we're united against the oppression. They got martial law, we got a shotgun. We attack like the Lion of Judah. And when we're done, you feel the roar from the people you can no longer ignore. So take action, they're at your front door. Listen up, 1, 2, 3, 4. Whoa, same tricks they used
us to protest the forced evictions and ethnic cleansing in Palestine this Saturday, May 22nd at 1 p.m. outside the State Library. Along with your signs and banners, please bring your masks and hand sanitizer to keep the rally COVID safe. For more information, head to Free Palestine Melbourne's Facebook page.
A 3CR supporter.
CR's annual Radiothon fundraiser launches in June, and this year we're asking you to be part of community-powered radio. It's only with your support that we're able to be independent, community-controlled, and focused on people rather than profits.
Your support during Radiothon powers the station to give voice to hundreds of people and issues for another year.
And remember, any amount you can afford makes a big difference, and all donations over $2 are tax deductible.
3CR Radiothon. Show your support during June 2021.
3CR Community Powered Radio.